I'm so glad you're able to join us if you are joining us live, and or thanks for downloading the program after the fact. For those of you joining us live, you have chosen the right sports program to watch this evening, and not a particular award show thrown by the four-letter network. So we appreciate you tuning in. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to hopefully be joined by one or both a couple of co-hosts. Unfortunately, John Sheeran, who is going to try and make this a semi-regular thing, that he is going to be on this program. He couldn't make it this week. And my usual co-host, Scott Schultz, he couldn't make it because he threw out his back, I suppose, today. He had every intention of joining us and everything. And unfortunately, today he had a little bit of an issue, and he might be able to join us. He kind of did some things to help remedy that. So send Scott some good vibes. Whether or not he joins us, send him some good vibes so that his back heals up and that we can get him on the program coming up here pretty soon. And then also I might be joined by Joe Goodberry. Got a lot of maybes tonight, but that's okay. Joe Goodberry is a somewhat regular guest on this program. He writes for The Athletic, former Cincy Jungle contributor and draft analyst. We haven't had him on, I don't think, since a little bit after the draft or so. So I want to, get his take on things, as well as and this is something that's going to be coming up on the next couple of episodes, but both he and John Sheeran should be in attendance at Bengals training camp coming up here. So I'm interested. Obviously, I would love to have them on tonight as well, but I do want them on in the near future as well, because they will be seeing the sights and sounds in person from the Bengals training camp. So training camp starts July 26th. And for those of you who are tuning in live today, which is a Wednesday evening, it's July 18th. So just over a week from now, the Bengals will be in training camp, and we'll be getting a lot of sights and sounds, a lot of news coming out of what the team's doing, how they look, all that kind of stuff. I had a few things on tap tonight, aside from usual listener questions. I'm going to try and get to those. So we'll get to those at the end here. But what I did want to get to, unfortunately, seeing as how I think we're going to talk a little more training camp next week when we have other hosts and potential guests cemented in, as well as the fact that training camp will be starting that week. So, I think we'll kind of go with that for next week. But unfortunately, I kind of want to start with the negative news machine that is surrounding the Cincinnati Bengals this offseason. And it's hard to sit here and say, well, I can't say that I don't understand it. I can't say that I don't expect it. There are, I've kind of said this before on this program, other programs, and on cincyjungle.com, where it's almost, I don't want to call it lazy journalism, because these guys, I don't want to even call myself a journalist per se, but I've written quite a few articles over the number of years with cincyjungle.com, and I know the work that goes into and the research that goes into some of these things. But there is a little bit of a sense of lazy journalism, a little bit, going on with the Cincinnati Bengals this year. We'll get to some haters and some certain things there in a second, but it's almost like because it's the Bengals mentality, a quote unquote, just because it's the Bengals. And I can't say I totally disagree with that. The Bengals have yet to win a playoff game under Marvin Lewis, with a number of basically three or four different starting quarterbacks, depending on how you want to look at it. Carson Palmer, John Kitna, AJ McCarron, Andy Dalton. And Kitna didn't start. I know. He came in, but he came in very early into that game. So essentially, Marvin Lewis has had four quarterbacks and has 7 playoff losses. So and no wins. So that's something. He was retained this year. Obviously, there are people that sit there and see that and go, well, okay, how do we expect things to be different? Management is still in place. There have been the shakeups on the coaching staff, obviously, and that's a big deal. Even though they are at the assistant ranks, there are some that seem to probably be able to give the Bengals a number of different improvements. Terrell Austin and Frank Pollock, obviously being the two that really stand out in that group. But for the most part, the Bengals still seem to be an afterthought in the AFC, still seem to be an afterthought in a lot of national media members' minds. Now, some people can sit here and say, well, I don't really care. I don't, it's not a big deal. It just matters what they do on the field. And I get that. True. I get it. And it's really just national opinion. As I said, lazy journalism might take place in some of these analyses that are coming out. Now, I'm going to get to some of the top Bengals haters. If you've tuned into this program for a long time, we've done a segment here and there called Bengals Hater of the Week, and it's usually a media member. Stephen A. Smith, I believe, was a prestigious winner of this award, and other awards. Other awardees have also been named on this program, but I kind of want to name just the top Bengals haters, and I wish I kind of had a little bit of a roundtable of co-hosts to talk about this tonight. But nevertheless, since it's been so prevalent this offseason, I think it's worth sharing. Now, I will say the most recent issue has come from ESPN. And ESPN has been a regular knocker of the Bengals, I guess, if you want to call them that. They basically have not been impressed with what the Bengals have done. And my colleague John Sheeran had written a post on CincyJungle.com about how the Bengals will be a bottom 5 team during the next 5 years. And the couple of people that they noted in and they are well-respected writers, especially Louis Riddick, who worked in NFL front offices, but they basically have some sort of metric that I don't necessarily agree with. Basically, their ranking of things, they kind of did a percentage system. Roster was 19th. Quarterback group, not just Andy Dalton, the group itself, 29th, meaning 19th in the league, 29th in the league. Coaching, 30th in the league. Draft, 17th. Front office, 27th. Now, you sit here and you go, okay, well, number one, I think the issue, if you think coaching is the issue, fair. I don't think the roster necessarily is the issue. So that's where I have an issue with, I kind of come to contention with the 19th ranked roster in the league. I can see how you maybe want to say middle of the pack, maybe top 12. Obviously, if everybody stays healthy, everything falls into place. It's a top 5 roster. John Ross, Tyler Eifert, Vontaze Burfict comes back and plays the rest of the season and plays the way he can. Andy Dalton plays more like the 2015 Andy Dalton. This roster is actually probably a top 10, maybe even top 5 type of roster. I don't see how you go, okay, how do you have your draft class, your draft approach, your draft class, whatever their thinking is on that 17th, yet your front office is ranked 27th. The draft is a major part of what the Bengals do and a major part of what they're about. There's a major disparity there. Regardless, I get it. This is talking points right before training camp. I get it. Really, what it comes down to with Louis Riddick's take, does anything ever really change in Cincinnati? ? Quote unquote. That's really what it's about. And then he continues on. This is a team that year after year has enough athletes and skilled players to make some noise in its division and conference. However, the problems remain the same. So if they have enough athletes and skilled players to make some noise in the conference in their division, how is their roster ranked 19th overall? I don't get it. So I guess I sit here and as we sit here now, I don't understand that one. Now, we're going to get to some others. And they are prominent national media members that have continued to hate on the Bengals. And it is what it is. Now, it's going to be interesting to see before I dive into these folks. It's going to be interesting to see what the Bengals and the players do this year, because this year kind of has a little bit of a similar feel to 2011. I guess actually more like 2009. 2011, they were just picked to be awful, and I mean the roster was they had at the time their top two wideouts gone, their starting quarterback gone. Cedric Benson was kind of a roller coaster at the time, who was their starting running back. You know, at that point, you were like, you may have thought that this was staring back at a 3-13 year type of thing. Obviously, they went 9-7 that year and made the playoffs. Pretty big surprise, and one of the better seasons under Marvin Lewis in terms of what he did with who he had. Now, I look back more at 2009, where there's the veterans. They have the veteran core. They've got some guys coming back from injury, but there's just so many question marks. Now, in 2009, the Bengals were picked to maybe be a mediocre type of team. They ended up sweeping the AFC North, you know, having a great year that year. They still lost in the first round of the playoffs to the Jets, but very good year. Now, I kind of look back at that year, not so much 2011, in this year. I'm not predicting playoffs necessarily for the Bengals per se, but I think that all of this hate that they're receiving, I think a lot of these folks are in for kind of a little bit of a rude awakening, because this team is not really as bad as they think. And everybody, of course, is on the Steelers bandwagon. And the big talking point this week, or this offseason, and I can't wait to get someone from Dogs by Nature on this program to talk about the Browns. But everybody thinks that, you know, their big talking point, because they want to be the guy or the gal that predicts it, that the Browns are going to be, you know, this major renaissance type of team, a team that, you know, is going to do well, and a lot of people even predict might be better than the Bengals. Now, one of those people who predicted that the Browns will be better than the Bengals is Colin Cowherd of Fox Sports. And if you have listened to, and this is where we're getting into the major haters of the Bengals, if you have listened to Colin Cowherd for any period of time, he does not trust or like Andy Dalton as a quarterback. He probably likes him as a guy, whatever. He does not trust Marvin Lewis as a head coach, and he does not like the Bengals organization. Now, those are all valid points of contention in one way or another, but he has them basically finishing dead last in the AFC North this year, tied record-wise with the Cleveland Browns, and that's including a relatively easy schedule. You know, he claims they're going to probably go 0-3, 0-4 to start the season. And if you go on his, whether or not you like his program, whatever, you can check out his stuff on his social media and all that stuff. The video, I'm sure, is up there. There's a clip that kind of went a little bit viral about, and there's another one I want to talk about too, but Colin Cowherd has always been a guy that really likes and has favored organizations that have it together. He's a big Patriots guy. He really likes the Yankees. He really, you know, he likes those big dynastic type of teams, and he is not shy about telling you about it. And so I don't know if you want to say it's just easy because, it's, you know, national media guy, he has to cover basketball, he has to cover football, he has to cover baseball. You know, I assume it's hard to keep track of every single transaction of every single team and all that. I'm going to say this. In his blasting of the Bengals and his predictions of the Bengals finishing last in the AFC North, Colin Cowherd referenced the fact that Adam Jones just got arrested. And he said that in a tone that made me, and probably anyone who listens to that clip, believe that he thinks Adam Jones is still on the roster. Adam Jones is not on the roster, Colin. That's just it's not accurate. So if you're kind of doing the narrative of, oh, same old Bengals, they're the safe haven of troubled people, troubled players, Adam Jones isn't on the team. Now, that doesn't mean he won't be added to the team if there's an injury or what have you later in the year. He's still a free agent. But let's not sit here and paint a picture that isn't accurate. And that's kind of what Colin Cowherd did. Another big Bengals hater that I've noticed, and this isn't to blast these guys. I mean, they have national programs, they have big viewership, big readership. So I mean, it is what they have successful careers, and whatever. But they also just kind of all they do is regurgitate narratives. And I'm not saying the Bengals are going to win the Super Bowl this year. I'm not even saying they're going to make the playoffs this year. They very well could make the playoffs this year. They very well could be. I think I've told a lot of people whether or not they make the playoffs this year, I think they will be far more enjoyable and more fun and entertaining to watch than the last 2 years that we've witnessed, 2016, 2017. Now, whether that equates to a massive amount of more wins or what have you, I don't know. But I think that this team this year will be much more entertaining to watch. I think there will be a better team. I just think they'll be better. I just don't know how many wins that's going to increase over what we've seen over the past 2 years. But regardless, Adam, I don't know how to totally pronounce his last name. Adam Sheen or Adam Shine. He's a New York media personality mostly, but he also does a lot of stuff for NFL Network, NFL.com, a lot of writing, and of course, in talking about teams and previews and all of that, he has once again pointed to the Bengals, and he is probably the biggest Andy Dalton hater I have ever seen in the national media. Again, there's not Andy Dalton as a playoff starter, 0-4, terrible performances for the most part. You can't hate him. You can't hate on Adam Shine to point that out, but at the same time, it just seems like a piling on of things and a piling on of old narratives, a piling on of old stereotypes on the Bengals. And I want to talk about these haters because I want to say I'm interested, as I mentioned at the onset of this segment, I'm interested to see what the Bengals will do this year, how they will react, if they take this kind of stuff as bulletin board material. Players can sit here and do the football speak all they want. I tune that stuff out. I tune that stuff out. I'm telling you what, they don't. And I'm telling you, just based on my experience at Cincy Jungle, a prominent, through SB Nation, a prominent sports blog, I've been contacted by people, relatives, agents, all kinds of stuff about stuff I have written, stuff that's been on our site, because people have read it. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm just saying that stuff's out there and players can say what they want. These are young guys who are on social media. They see stuff. I'm sure their friends see stuff and send it to them. Hey, did you see this about you or what have you? They read stuff. And, this stuff that comes out, especially on NFL.com, stuff on Fox Sports from Colin Cowherd and Adam Shine, I am hard-pressed to believe that this kind of stuff is not being seen by a number of different players on the Bengals. Peter Neefus in our live YouTube chat says, "I'm okay with the Bengals playing under the radar. Low expectations equals low pressure." That's and I agree with that sentiment, and maybe that's the sentiment that the Bengals, after 5 straight playoff seasons, lost. Marvin Lewis here for a long time, 0-7 playoff record. Andy Dalton 0-4 as a starter in the postseason. Maybe it's time. Hey, let's have some fun. Who cares what those people say? I mean, at some point, as a sports team, whether you're a coach or a player, let's just take the pressure off and let's just do what we do and have some fun. And I think if you witness what now maybe that's just not possible with some of the figureheads in this franchise, Marvin Lewis, Andy Dalton, I mean, to both a lesser and bigger extent, Mike Brown, but you can see it in these big games how tight the team plays. They play so tight, and I would just like them to show a little bit more of a lax nature, a little bit more of, hey, let's just go out there, let's have fun. We've prepped well. Let's just let our talent take over and go from there. But I'm kind of at a loss in terms of what else to say about these haters? These guys are always going to hate, and these two guys are always going to talk about them until the Bengals, and namely Marvin Lewis, Andy Dalton, make changes, win playoff games, and Mike Brown does some things differently in the organization. We're going to talk about that in just a second. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. I'm Anthony Cosenza. I will hopefully be joined by either Scott Schulte and or Joe Goodberry later tonight. We'll see. If not, you got me. You got me. But I appreciate you tuning in live. I appreciate all of you who download this program. You can get it on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, cincyjungle.com. And you can get in touch with us via email, theobinsider@gmail.com, or via Twitter @BengalsOBI. We're going to be taking a couple of listener questions at the end of the program. So leave it in the live YouTube chat. Hit us up on Twitter, or if email is the best, you could do it there. Also, we are monitoring the comment thread on cincyjungle.com. So if you've got a question there, definitely leave it, and we will try to get to it at the end of the show. I wanted to kind of go a different direction, but I guess this is a pretty good segue in terms of organizational issues. You know, I talked about Mike Brown changing. Also on Colin Cowherd's show recently, TJ Houshmandzadeh, veteran receiver and retired receiver, played a number of seasons in Cincinnati and still holds the single season record for catches in a season with 112. He went on Colin Cowherd's show and made a number of interesting proclamations. And if you're on Twitter, this was subsequently backed up by former Bengals cornerback Ashley Ambrose, who made a Pro Bowl with the Bengals in '96. And after kind of putting some stuff out there, Ashley Ambrose followed me on Twitter. So, Coach Ambrose, good to see you. Thanks for following me. But interesting and disturbing details coming from TJ Houshmandzadeh, if you haven't heard about this. And I don't want to make this show completely negative, because we are going into training camp. I'm going to talk about some other stuff that's a little more positive, but this is stuff that is worth noting. TJ Houshmandzadeh, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to tell you this right now. It's going to start very, very negative, and then it'll kind of his stuff kind of spins a little positive, and I'll tell you why in just a second. So, TJ Houshmandzadeh was a 7th-round pick in 2001, obviously college teammates with Chad Johnson. Those two ended up teaming up and being a very formidable duo, a receiving duo. Obviously, the team had other guys, Chris Henry, Kelly Washington, guys that really helped out at wide receiver as well. But those were the two most high-profile guys, both in production and swagger, I guess. But TJ Houshmandzadeh, one of my favorite players of who has played for the Bengals really in recent years. I've actually met him in person. Decent guy, like him, good guy, personable. He has not been one to shy away from just telling stuff like it is. And what's interesting is he has been, and I guess it's because of the Southern California connection. Hoosh lives in Barstow, California, which is kind of towards the desert a little bit of California, probably from where I live in Orange County, California. It's about 2.5 hours away drive. John Ross, he's been working with John Ross this offseason and doing a lot of stuff with him. John Ross went to Long Beach, or lived in Long Beach, and Long Beach is southwest LA essentially. So, not far from each other. Those guys, distance-wise are doing a lot of stuff, and they're working together, which is cool. However, Hoosh went on Colin Cowherd's show and noted that the Bengals had offered players used jock straps. They did things where, and this one I kind of knew about, players stayed at home the night before a game. They didn't stay in a hotel with the rest of the team. And then, of course, he also talked about, they didn't supply bottled water, Gatorade, all that kind of stuff. Now, when we relayed this story on CincyJungle.com, there was overwhelmingly, you know, basically screw Mike Brown type of comments, and this is not surprising because that's Mike Brown in a nutshell, that sort of thing. There are a couple of folks who actually kind of came in. I don't want to say came to the defense of Mike Brown, but actually made comments such as, why should he, meaning Mike Brown, why should he be forced to give his players bottles of Gatorade, bottles of water, fresh equipment? Why should he pay for that when these guys are making a lot of money? I kind of see that a little bit, but this is, if you're a small business owner that owns a business that isn't making, isn't a multi-million-dollar, multi-billion-dollar type of enterprise, I can see not necessarily supplying Gatorade or water to your employees on a daily basis. This is even in the 90s and early 2000s when, yes, football was very popular, but it still wasn't as popular and as big as it is. Fantasy football has really taken off since the 90s and early 2000s. There's a number of different ways to watch games. Thursday night football has become a thing during the week. So there's a lot of different stuff and a lot of different ways that owners can make a lot of money. The point is this is a professional sports franchise. And yes, if this was a small business thing, I understand a small business owner maybe not being able to afford, or nor should they feel inclined to afford some of the luxuries to its employees if that payroll isn't necessarily dictating that. This is the Browns have, their franchise is essentially worth about $1 billion. We've seen the figures over the last handful of years. It's in the 800, 900 millions, according to Forbes magazine. This is an owner, and this is a family. This is a team that can really afford to buy and supply new jock straps, not used ones, new jock straps to its players. You can go to Sam's Club or Costco or whatever if you really want to save money and go buy pallets of Gatorade and waters to give to your team. These are little things that add up to big things. That's kind of my point. And it's why the Bengals have always been an afterthought in free agency. It's why there's a stigma about the ownership and the way the team is run the way it is. And it's why they've kind of been a little bit of a laughing stock amongst the league. Now, you can place blame wherever you want. You can place it on Mike Brown. You can place it on his father, who also was very frugal about some of these things for their players. Whatever your thoughts are on this, my point is the Bengals are not presenting themselves, or let me backtrack. At least in the Mike Brown, or the early part of Mike Brown era, they have not presented themselves as a first-class franchise, and that has never been their MO. That has never been, it's almost as if, at least from 91 until 2002, and you'll see why in a second, why I stop it at 2002. It's almost as if the Brown family, or Mike Brown, is this: you are privileged to play for us. Yes, that's true to a certain extent. You are making a lot of money. You're playing a professional sport, and barring something ridiculous, you're going to have a lot of money for a good portion of your life if you're responsible with it. I get that. But this is a professional sports franchise, and in the most successful American sports league there is, that just basically prints its own money. You got to do the little things. You got to do the little things. Now, TJ's, eye-opening remarks were very tough to swallow. Again, not totally surprising, unfortunately. I mean, that's just, it is what it is there. But what he did say is that things changed when Marvin Lewis came on board. Now, Marvin Lewis did come from one of the premier franchises, I guess, in the Baltimore Ravens. And I say premier because they had just won a Super Bowl a few years before he had gotten to Cincinnati. I don't know what the job interview was with Marvin. I don't know some of the, if he, usually in a job interview, there's kind of like, what ideas would you bring to the table? There's some sort of generic question like that. I don't know if Marvin said, look, we got to do the little things better. And it's kind of ironic because there's so many little things when he's been a head coach, whether it's challenges or getting prepped for primetime games or playoff games, that sort of thing, where he has not shown up on that front. But there are things, and Houshmandzadeh said it, that when Marvin came on board, things changed. Things changed, and for the better. Guys were staying at the same hotel. They were meeting the night before, the day before games. I don't know about the Gatorade thing because you heard Jonathan Joseph when he left in free agency back in the 2011 offseason. He kind of pissed and moaned about that, whatever. But there's at least he has brought some sort of semblance of modernity to the team and a sense of professionalism on some level to a team that's just kind of been, we're gonna get guys, we're gonna hope we get talent, and we're gonna pay guys some money, and that's that. Now, obviously, they're a little bit more professional than that. They were more professional than that than the 90s and early 2000s, but that you can kind of see the attitude. I mean, it's a little eye-opening from TJ Houshmandzadeh that he has brought that about especially publicly. And some of the stuff you hear is just yikes. And that's not what a professional football team. And again, people can say, well, I don't get this kind of stuff at my job. And I don't. Yeah, true. You may not get bottles of water on the regular, but you may have a water jug where you can get all the water you want. You may have, I don't know. You may have other perks that other guys don't. And I'm not saying the football players are better people than regular citizens, but when you are working for an organization that is within one of the, top 1-2% in terms of what the team makes, what these players make, I kind of think, you supply them with this stuff, and little things go a long way sometimes with employees, and little things create big things. And it's good to hear that Marvin Lewis, and I think for a lot of people, especially myself, when you hear, you kind of look at Marvin coming back again this offseason, you're going, really? When you hear this kind of stuff, you are inclined to think, maybe he does have the old man's ear a little bit. Maybe he has made some changes that we have not fully seen. It's kind of more behind the scenes stuff, and Lewis has done that. So at a minimum, aside from making the team competitive, and I think that correlates. If what TJ is saying is true in terms of Lewis making these small changes that end up being big ones, obviously it is correlated to the team at least being competitive, winning division titles, things that they did not do in 13 years before his arrival. So I don't, I've been very up and down about my support for Marvin Lewis, but at a minimum, I have to give him a little bit of a pat on the back on that, because it sounds like the team he as a head coach has made some very significant strides in terms of doing some of these small things for the players and making this more of a professional atmosphere for the Bengals. So you got to give him some kudos on that. And you also got to say, shame on whoever it was, Mike Brown, his lack of a general manager to allow some of this stuff to happen over the past, in the pre-Marvin Lewis era. So what do you think? You can let us know in the live YouTube chat or other avenues. Again, we're on YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, cincyjungle.com. You can join us every week in the live YouTube chat. You can also get in touch with us via email, theobinsider@gmail.com, and on Twitter at BengalsOBI. We're going to be answering a few more questions, a few listener questions at the end of the show. I'm just going to kind of go through a couple of live comments. Michael Myers, honestly, water and Gatorade for 100-plus players and staff is what, $300 to $400 a game? Come on, man. I assume that means he is in support of the fact that the Bengals should be supplying this. That's kind of the tone I got there. I mentioned the ESPN post, Nick Marks, that ESPN post that just hit Cincy Jungle mentioned lack of faith in the front office owner. I'm not familiar enough with the rest of the league situations to really know if it is bad as everyone says. That's true. That's true. Unfortunately, you just kind of you hear a few more things about the Bengals organizational structure and how it's not so great than you do about other teams. So that's kind of where I'm like, well, where there's smoke, there's fire a little bit. Let's see. Disheartening, Nick Marks again, disheartening for newer fans to read that stuff. That doesn't appear it is going to change anytime soon. It might not. Mr. Blaze 187 says Mike Brown will not change. Waste of breath. Need Katie to take over. Yeah, I mean, I see some things and hear some things from Katie Blackburn that seems refreshing, but again, she's she's still the offspring of Mike, and she's been around. She's seen how her father has run the team. She's seen how her grandfather has run the team. It's going to take. I think it's not only going to take potentially a more modern look at things like Katie Blackburn could potentially bring, but it's going to take another outside force. Maybe along with Marvin Lewis, maybe it's a different one from Marvin Lewis, but it's going to take a general manager. It's going to take someone that they hire from the outside like they did with Marvin Lewis, and it's going to take them getting the ears of leadership to be able to do this. So we'll see. Let's see what time we got. We're running a little short on time, but I'm just going to touch on this subject. And I think it's a pretty good debate topic. And the only reason I bring it up is because in case you have not been paying attention to cincyjungle.com, I've been unveiling a top 10 players under Marvin Lewis list on cincyjungle.com. So far, in case you haven't seen, what we've unveiled is number 10 is Leon Hall, number 9 was Rudy Johnson, number 8 was Andy Dalton, and number 7 was Carlos Dunlap. When I unveiled Andy Dalton at number 8, there was some polarizing comments there, and there were some polarizing opinions kind of saying, essentially, that Andy Dalton should be ranked ahead of Carson Palmer on a list such as this in the Marvin Lewis era. I see the point. I see the argument. Spoiler alert, that's not how I have it. And I'm not going to tell you Carson Palmer does make the list, and he does make the list ahead of Andy Dalton. I'm not going to tell you where. You're going to have to read. Going to make you do some work. But that's how I have it. And yes, Andy Dalton has supplanted Carson Palmer in terms of record books, in terms of playoff appearances, and in terms of certain things. And it's a close argument. It's a close debate. I think a lot of people are more inclined to side with Dalton because of who Andy Dalton is as a guy and because of what happened with Carson Palmer and him leaving the franchise. But, yes, both guys had a lot of surrounding talent. However, Palmer had less surrounding talent on defense than what Dalton has had. Dalton has inherited an excellent defense. He inherited AJ Green. He's had a lot. I think a lot more to work with. Now, Carson Palmer had probably a better offensive line throughout most of his career with the Bengals than Andy Dalton did, particularly the last 2 seasons we've seen from the Bengals offensive line. But I think where the Bengals were, what they needed out of a number 1 overall pick, the fact that he sent them to 2 playoff berths with 2 very different looking rosters. I just have Palmer slightly above Andy Dalton at this point in terms of overall Bengals players in the Marvin Lewis era. And I also think that, when you were to construct the blueprint, I guess, of an NFL quarterback, 6'5", 230, rocket arm, accurate, pocket passer. He was very immobile compared to, say, a guy like Aaron Rodgers or what have you that still have a lot of those traits. But he is a classic pocket passer and if you watch some of his throws, they were ridiculous. And granted, it needed to have good protection. Things needed to kind of hold up and, guys needed to do their jobs. But to me, I still have Carson Palmer a little bit ahead of Andy Dalton in terms of quarterbacks, in terms of what's happened with this team. Now, I think when it's all said and done, and obviously the Andy Dalton story has yet to be written, fully written at least. I think there's just a little bit of a difference there. Now, unfortunately for Palmer, you look at the playoffs. Okay, Dalton has lost 4 games as a starter. I guess you could say Palmer lost 2 games as a starter. I mean, he threw 1 pass. He played 2 offensive snaps and threw 1 pass in one of the playoff berths. And the pass was a 66-yard completion. So who knows how he would have played had he been healthy the rest of that Steelers game. I still contend that the Bengals probably would have barely won that game, maybe moved on to AFC Championship, probably not Super Bowl, but probably would have made some noise that year had Carson Palmer not been hurt. Of course, woulda, coulda, shoulda. We know that. I just, I think about what Palmer did that year, and yes, he had a lot of help. I think about what could have been with that, and I think that the fact that Dalton in the primetime games, Dalton in those playoff games has played awful. And we really only saw Palmer, who didn't play well against the Jets in that 2009 wildcard game. We really only saw him play 1 playoff game. So it's hard to sit here and say, well, if you gave Palmer 4 opportunities, he wouldn't have played as well, or he would have played worse than Dalton. You can't really say that. But you also have to marvel at the fact that Dalton did lead the team to 5 straight playoff berths. Again, he had 4 straight starts in the playoffs, and he broke a number of Carson Palmer's records. To me, it's close, but for right now, I still have Carson Palmer based on what he inherited, how he was able to raise a level of play from certain players around him, and just, I guess, a little bit of nostalgia in the fact that the team was so bad before he took over as the starter, essentially, with the exception of 2003, was so bad and was in such a bad way at the quarterback position that he, gave them a massive boost at that spot. And that's who I have. I do want to hear from you and your thoughts on if you got Palmer or Dalton. I'm looking here. I'm seeing Peter Neefus has agreed. If Dalton gets a ring, his numbers are good enough for the Hall of Fame. I see that. I think especially if he goes on a run like a Flacco, historically with it. Unfortunately, here's the thing. I mean, if you look at his numbers, he's got the highest quarterback rating in Bengals history with anyone who has significant pass attempts. He's got, I think he's 2nd or 3rd in overall passing yards. He owns 2 of the single season passing yard records. He owns the single season touchdown record. So I mean, he owns a lot of records. It's just the fact of playing. It's playing poorly when the lights are the brightest. And I think this is a great. Andrew Seiler says Dalton for sure. Rick Reed says Carson would have got killed with that last year with that line. Well, yeah, because Carson may have been able to make some throws that Dalton cannot make because of arm strength and a little bit of accuracy and all that kind of stuff. But Dalton at least is a bit more mobile than Carson is, and or was, because Carson retired now. But I think because Carson was a bit more of a statue behind that line last year, that would have been a disaster. So agreed with Rick Reed there. And Zachary Stemple, I think this kind of an interesting take. And Zachary knows how to ride a fence, apparently. They are about equal, honestly. And that's fair. That's fair. I mean, there's a lot of feathers in the cap for both guys and a lot of different takes. And I think when it's all said and done, we'll probably say that Andy Dalton was a better Bengals quarterback than Carson Palmer, based on career stats and all of that. But he's got to do more in the postseason. And so for those of you who have been paying attention to those top 10 Bengals players in Marvin Lewis era on Cincy Jungle, we'll be counting those down. Carson Palmer has yet to make his appearance, but he will be making it, and he will be ahead of Andy Dalton, like it or not. But I think it's worth a debate, and I think that that's going to be a lively one once that post goes up. But check it out. It should be coming up over the next week and a half, and I think it's enjoyable. Thanks for tuning in tonight. We're going to get out of here with some listener questions, but in case you are new to the program, thanks for tuning in live. Thanks for downloading the program. You can get it on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, cincyjungle.com, and then you can also get all of our stuff and get in contact with us via Twitter at BengalsOBI and via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. We got some stuff on our Twitter, and it's actually from one of our regular listeners, Carlos Andre, at CarlosAndre81. Are you worried about the Bengals quarterback room? I really don't trust Barkley, and I think Driscoll and Woodside are question marks at this point. What are your thoughts on that? Would you try and make a trade, Bridgewater, or even hire a current free agent guy for the backup spot? Well, I think regardless, I mean, unless the Bengals – here's the thing. Andy Dalton, you can say what you want about him and his primetime performances and all of that, and arm strength, there's all kinds of stuff you could really nitpick about him. One of the things he has been very good about is being durable. So the Bengals have been a bit spoiled a little, in terms of they haven't really had to think about – yes, they don't have necessarily the best quarterback in the league, but they've got a pretty good one. And they haven't really had to think about the fact of if he gets hurt. Now, he did in 2015 during an amazing season he was having, and A.J. McCarron came in, played admirable. And, but then at that time, the Bengals had a pretty good backup quarterback. Now, they have a very similar guy in Matt Barkley in terms of a successful college guy that hasn't really been able to start and for whatever reason. And, it hasn't been the college guy that he was. I think regardless, obviously in theory, if you want to trade for Teddy Bridgewater or other guys, I think in theory that makes a lot of sense, but who knows? Quarterbacks net high trade yields. What are you really going to try and give up for a guy that's a backup quarterback? I think if you're really going to look at a Bridgewater or somebody like that, you got to be in a pretty bad way at quarterback, meaning Dalton's hurt. He really looks terrible. He's not getting the playbook, which none of that really falls into the Andy Dalton tent, if you will. I think a trade for a Bridgewater or somebody like that is if the Bengals are in a really bad way in terms of Andy Dalton and what's going on there. And I know I'm a USC homer a little bit, but I actually am a little bit higher on Barkley than some Bengals fans are, and not to the extent of maybe starting games and starting a playoff game like A.J. McCarron did, but maybe as a spot start. I think, he played for a couple of teams that weren't that great. He was on the Bears when the Bears weren't that great, and he just kind of played for some teams that were blah. I think that this roster with the offensive talent, he can maybe get by a little bit better than he did on some other teams if the Bengals needed to rely on him. I do agree, though, with Carlos that if Dalton does go down for a significant period of time, then I worry. And I think then that's when you kind of maybe mortgage the future a little bit in terms of draft capital, which the Bengals highly value. And then you look at getting, a guy that might be out there. Who knows? It may even be A.J. McCarron because the Bills are in love with Josh Allen, and even though they brought in A.J. McCarron to maybe be a bridge starter, I mean, it sounds like he might not even be able to do that. So, I think they're okay going into the season with Dalton and Barkley. I do not trust Logan Woodside, and I'm not going to say too much. I've heard some things about him. I've obviously that DUI arrest shortly before, I think it was in June. That's alarming. Productive kid out of Toledo, and has a decent skill set. Not an overly big guy, probably pretty similar to Dalton in terms of mobility and being able to do some different things. But I think that's a guy who needs to mature in a number of different fronts, both emotionally and as a professional quarterback. So I'm not really big on him. And Driscoll, he's almost more of an athlete than a quarterback, and I'm not really sold on him. I'd rather have more of at least a tiny bit more of a polished guy, a guy with NFL experience, a guy who could, really do a couple of things that Dalton could do should Dalton go down. So I think right now, as we look at it, it'll probably be Dalton and Barkley. I'm okay with that. Obviously it's not the greatest duo, but I'm okay with that, and I think they try and develop Woodside on the practice squad along with maybe somebody else. We also need to keep our eye on cuts. They picked up Driscoll after final cuts, and that could be somebody that they look at as well. Likely someone that they play against in the preseason. The Bengals seem to like to pick up some of those guys, so keep an eye on that. But for now, I'm okay with Dalton and Barkley. Not the best, but it's okay. I like this one from Nick Marks, and it was from earlier in the show. Basically talking about Andy Dalton quarterback sneaking and if that's going to be kind of a staple in the Bengals offense. Now, in recent years, we've seen a lot of it. And when I looked up Andy Dalton's stats, he actually has, I think, 16 or 18 touchdown runs in his career, which is kind of a lot for a guy that's not, he's not a Michael Vick. He's not a quote unquote running quarterback. He's not a Cam Newton. It by far outweighs Ken Anderson and Boomer Esiason and Carson Palmer in terms of touchdown rushes, which is it's a pretty impressive stat. They do a lot of RPOs, run pass options. They've done that before. I think I saw a little bit more of it under Hugh Jackson than I did under Ken Zampese or Bill Lazor, but we've seen it, and I think it's going to be particularly effective if the Bengals can get push up front, obviously, and if the running game could be at least somewhat established and more so than the past couple of years. Because I think at that point, if you at least have the threat to say, hey, we're going to hand it off to Mixon, to Bernard, Walton, whoever, and that's the play the defense is going to read, that's going to open something up where he can bootleg it out potentially on the outside. Now, Dalton, for not being, he's not small. He's about 6'2", 6'2 and a half, 215, 220. For not being the 6'5", 6'6 guy that you want, just to charge forward on a quick snap and move forward and on a 4th and inches, he's actually been effective getting into the scrum there and getting some first downs and things like that. So I still think it's a part of the game plan. I think it's going to be used. I don't think it's going to be used as much as we saw. Hugh Jackson really got creative with a lot of different stuff, and we've seen some of that dissipate since he left. But I think Dalton will still do some things in terms of running, in terms of RPOs, all that kind of stuff. And I think that's going to be a staple this year, but maybe just not as heavily as we've seen in previous years. But that's okay. I mean, uh, if other things are working, then you won't really need that, except for when you need, kind of get a little creative and give a different wrinkle to um, the defense, and that's okay. And I'm gonna end on this. It's not really a question, but it's from Mr. Blaze 187, and I think it's because I wrote this on a recent mailbag on CincyJungle.com. He wrote, "Here's my bold prediction: Cedric Ogbuehi will play right tackle, and he'll be a good one." Now, I didn't write that Cedric Ogbuehi was going to be a good right tackle. I just said that I think that he has shown improvement, and I think that he might win that right tackle spot this year, at least at the beginning. I also don't believe that whoever's going to play right guard or right tackle is going to play all 16 games, be it because of injury, be it because of effectiveness or lack thereof. I just think that I think they might try and get him out there based on Frank Pollock's coaching, and I think also you can't underestimate a guy who is in the last year of his contract. The Bengals declined his fifth-year option of his contract, rightfully so. That's fine. Guys playing in a contract year, they tend to play harder. They want, especially in football, because that second contract is, chances are it's the last one you're getting. So, or at least the last long one you're getting. So, I think there's some merit there. I could sound like an idiot 2 months from now. Who knows? But I'm kind of on the same line with Mr. Blaze 187 there in our live YouTube chat. We're going to get out of here. Thanks so much for tuning in. I want to give a little shout out to both Andrew Seiler and Nick Marks. I've mentioned them before on the show. But as we kicked off the show, Andrew Seiler says, "Love you guys. Had a bad day at work, and this is a nice way to end the day. You guys rule." And Nick Marks is glad to catch you all live this evening. We all, first of all, Andrew, I hope your day gets better, and you got 2 more left in the work week, considering if you work a standard work week. But hope the rest of the week gets better for you. I hope this podcast at least got your mind off of some stuff for a little bit. Thanks for the kind words, and thanks for tuning in. Thanks to all of you for tuning in and for your questions. Appreciate all of your support. If you haven't yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our iTunes account, subscribe to SoundCloud, all of our materials on there. We do put up most of our material on CincyJungle.com. You can also keep it there at Cincy Jungle during training camp, because there's going to be a ton of material and a ton of stuff coming up on that account. So keep it there. We're going to put a lot of material out, and I think you'll enjoy it. If you need to get in touch with us, or if you want to get in touch with us via Twitter at BengalsOBI and via email, the OBinsider at gmail.com. Appreciate you tuning in, and I apologize we only had me tonight. Hope that was still okay. I had a couple of tentative guests scheduled for tonight, but we'll have more, especially as training camp goes on, and we'll have some good stuff coming down the pike, I promise. And appreciate all the support. We'll talk to you guys next week.